Good day everyone! In this video, we will be discussing about the two major aspects of language and power relationship. And these are power in discourse and power behind discourse. Without further ado, let's get started! Power in discourse looks at the language itself, the language used in the discourse, and how power relationships are demonstrated through language. For power in discourse, consider discourse as a place where relations of power are exercised or enacted. So the example we have here is an extract from a visit to a premature baby unit by a doctor, which is the D here, and a group of medical students as part of the students training program. So kindly just pause your screen on this part because we might consume too much time if I read all this. So what have you noticed from this extract? Before we discuss what we may have noticed or realized in this example, I will just inform you first of what are these sets of punctuation marks serves or indicates. Well, the dot here indicates that the participant paused shortly. On the other hand, the dash one signifies longer pause. As for the extended bracket, this means an overlap, or there's an overlap between the two participants' responses. Never mind the parenthesis, as this is a talk which was not distinguishable enough to transcribe. Well, one of the things that we can immediately notice is the striking feature marked by these brackets, just like in numbers 3, 9, 11, 13, and 19. Well, these were actually the times where the doctor interrupts the student. So, why did the doctor do that? Is it because the doctor wants to do all the talking? Well, I don't think so. In fact, from the flow of their conversation, it's obvious that the doctor did the interruptions in order to control or manage the contributions of the student, to stop him from beginning the examination before washing his hands, to stop him from repeating certain information and stating the obvious or saying unnecessary things which is not relevant to the or to what is being asked. The doctor, we can say that the doctor just wants to ensure that the student gives the key information expected. So obviously, in this discourse, the doctor is the one who is in control. Well, apart from that, there are many ways this control is exercised over the student's contributions in the discourse. First, in the opening turn, wherein the doctor announced the nature of what is going to go on in the examination. Second, when the student is explicitly told when to begin. Third is the explicit sequence of actions that are said by the doctor in which the student has to perform. This is in dialogue 3. Fourth is when the student's contribution is evaluated by the doctor, like giving positive encouragement, just like in dialogue 5, which is very good, and in 7, which is that's right. And fifth is when the student is put on the spot with a series of questions thrown by the doctor. So, based from the given example, we can say that power in discourse has something to do with participants controlling and constraining the contributions of the non powerful participants. And based from the extract, the powerful participant is the doctor, because in an indirect sense, the doctor is the one who is in control, who have prerogatives to directly constrain the contributions by selecting the discourse type, whereas the non-powerful one would be the student. So, since power in discourse has something to do with constraints, it is therefore important for us to know or to distinguish the three types of constraints, and these are constraints on content, relations, subjects. So on content, this one is actually a control or constraints on what to say and what to be done. Or in simpler term, it is on the topic. Then next is relations. This is refers to social relations that the people enter when they become part of a certain discourse or they become a participants in a particular discourse. Then last we have subjects. Subjects is the subject positions people can occupy when they enter a certain discourse. Well, these three actually co-occurs in practice. In fact, the example we discussed earlier illustrates this three. How? Well, on contents, the student is required to conduct an examination which is in accordance to a learned routine. And in terms of relation, in this examination, the student is operating in a professional relationship to his audience and a subordinate relationship to the doctor, while occupying the subject positions or subject of aspirant. And these are doctor as well as the student. Now let us move on to power in cross-cultural encounters. What about unequal encounters where the non-powerful people have this cultural and linguistic backgrounds which is different from those of the powerful people? Well, this type of encounter is actually common, for instance, in gatekeeping encounters such as in job interview, in which a gatekeeper who, let's say, belongs to the societally dominant cultural grouping controls or is the one who is in control of that encounter, in which he or she has these capabilities to determine whether someone gets a particular job or gets access to some other valued objectives. Now, speaking of interviews, well, accordingly, interviewers tend to assume that the interviewees are already familiar with what we call the dominant ways of conducting interviews. And in turn, the interviewees' contributions are expected to be interpreted on the assumption that they are capable of working out what is being required, especially in terms of these dominant conventions. So, if an interviewee, let's say, gives what is felt to be poor or irrelevant answer to a question raised by the interviewers, this may be an indication to her lack of requisite knowledge or experience. So, in this case, miscommunications may also be the reason. It may happen due to the differences in discoursal conventions. So basically, people may be denied of jobs and other valuable social goods through misconceptions, which is based upon cultural insensitivity and dominance. Well, actually, miscommunications often happen. For instance, let us consider this example. This is actually a snippet which is from a stimulated job interview for a post in a library with a member of an American cultural minority, which is the C2 here. So C2 is the one who is being interviewed. Well, one thing we can immediately notice is that C2's English is actually appears to be native-like, especially when we talk about its grammar and vocabulary. So perhaps this is the things that eventually lead the interviewer to dismiss any thoughts on the possibility of cultural-based miscommunication, even though it will be possible in this case. Well, apart from that, C2 indeed has failed to interpret the interviewer's question in the obvious way. Because what is the interviewer trying to do here is to ask C2 to show what she could do in her professional work in the library if appointed to the post. But the obvious way is actually the way within a specific culture of the interview, not on the culture of the interviewee. Furthermore, power in cross-cultural encounters entails that discourse types and orders of discourse may vary across cultures. Aside from that, Power in discourse between members of different cultural groupings is in the perspectives that the outcome of such interview, let's say the participants is being denied of jobs, it is not actually only due to cultural differences, but more than that. It includes differences in skin color and lifestyle. So, as you have noticed, all our examples had been on face to face discourse. So, this time around, we will move on to mass media discourse. Well, mass media discourse have this implicit nature of the power relations being enacted, or in other words, it involves hidden relations of power. So, as you may already know, media discourse is designed for mass audiences. So, in turn, the producers have no knowledge as to who is in the audience. What media producers tend to do is to address an ideal subject, be it viewer or listener or reader. Now, what is the nature of the power relations in media discourse? Well, obviously, the producers are the one who is in control or who exercise power over the consumers, for they have the sole producing rights, so they get to decide and determine what is to be included and excluded, or how events are to be represented, and even the subject's positions of their audiences. So we have here an example, which is an article from a local newspaper. So who do you think is exercising power in this article? Perhaps we can say that it is the journalist, because obviously he or she is the one who wrote the piece. But we also do know that journalists work under editorial control. So perhaps it could be the editor, or it could also be the newspaper itself as a sort of institutional collective. Well, based from the example, generally, it is obvious that the people and organizations that the media use as sources in their news reporting do not exactly represent equally all social groupings in the population. They feature more on the government ministers rather than the unemployed people, and industrial managers or trade union officials more than the shop floor workers. Well, in this case, the unequal influence of social groupings can immediately be spotted, or it is already indicated clearly, especially in terms of who gets to be interviewed. In fact, in the example, the one who is interviewed is the parish council and the quarry management. Now, let us move on to the causality in this report. Well, when we say causality, it is the relation between the cause and its effects, or the relation between the two regularly correlated events. And in this report, who is represented as causing what to happen and who is represented as doing what to whom? Well, first thing first, we may notice that the grammatical form in which the headline, which is query load shedding problem, is actually cast in the form of nominalization, in which the process of load shedding is expressed as a noun or in a noun phrase, as if it were an entity. Well, one clear effect of this grammatical form is that crucial effects of the process will be left unspecified. In particular, however, we don't really know who or what is shedding loads or causing loads to be shed. And in this case, causality is unspecified. Well, causality is attributed to unsheathed lorries. Well, this itself contains unspecified causality again. Well, it is actually difficult to take literally the notion that the lorries are the one who caused the problem. And it is evident in a different representation that it could also be that this someone, presumably the quarry management or the people under their control, are the one who is responsible. Yet the quarry management figure only in the second paragraph. The report, although we cannot be that sure, but it seems like it represents from a quite different perspectives as the antisocial consequences of unscrupulous cutting on the part of the quarry owners in a way that it presents the consequences, but who causes that consequences or who is responsible for that is not presented. Furthermore, the power being exercised in this discourse is the power to disguise power. Well, power to disguise power is also a form of the power to constrain content, which is to favor certain interpretations and wordings of events while excluding others. It is a form of hidden power, for the favored interpretations and wordings are those of the power holders in our society. Now, we can therefore conclude that the media operate as a means for the expression and reproduction of the power of the dominant class. And apart from that, the mediated power of the existing power holders is also a hidden power because of its implicity. Now we are finally done with power and discourse. So let us proceed to power behind discourse. So power behind discourse. This is actually where the social order of discourse or the connections of the exchange is put together and held together as a hidden effect of power. For example, standardization. This is a process wherein a particular social dialect is elevated into what we call a standard or even a national language. Now, speaking of standardization, this is actually part of a much wider process of not just economic but also political and cultural unification. Moreover, we can think of its growth as a long process of colonization, whereby it just immediately took over the major social institutions of literature, government, administration, law, religion, and even education. Now, to be very particular, we have Standard English, which emerged as the language of political and cultural power. And it is not only that, because it is also the language of the politically and culturally powerful individuals. Furthermore, Standard English was then regarded as correct English. On the other hand, the other social dialects were stigmatized not only in terms of correctness but also in terms which indirectly reflected on the lifestyles, morality, and so forth of their speakers. Now we are done with one of the three identified aspects of power behind discourse according to Fairclough. Now let us move on to a particular discourse types. We will consider the discourse of medical examination, particularly the gynecological examinations, as an example. Our focus will be on how medical staffs and patients are positioned in relation to each other, especially in the conventions of discourse type. And apart from that, we will also look at how this positioning can be seen as an effect of power of those who dominate medical institutions over the conventions. Well, according to one account of gynecological examinations, participants such as the medical staffs, they are actually subject to contradictory pressure, in which they are torn between treating their patients as a technical object and treating them sensitively as a person. And here's the thing, they are actually feel obliged to treat their patient in a nonchalant way or disengaged way by treating them as a technical object while trying to establish that their interest in their patients' bodies are purely medical and not sexual. On the other hand, they are also feel obliged to treat the patient sensitively as a person, meaning to say they have to cancel out the indignity of treating her as a technical object. Because apparently, exposing one's sexual organs is an overwhelming taboo. These contradictory pressures are actually evident in the conventions for the discourse type or for this particular discourse type. Take for instance, there is the presence of constraints on the settings of gynecological examinations in which they put too much importance in guaranteeing that the encounter will appear to be strictly medical one, to be a medical one. Well, such examinations can legitimately be undertaken, of course, in a medical space such as a hospital or a consulting room. Well, aside from settings, there are also constraints on the subjects, in which there is a restricted set of legitimate subject positions. And these are those of the doctor, the nurse, and the patient. And there are strict limitations on who can occupy them. There are also requirements for modes of dress, which help reinforce properties of the setting in defining the encounter as purely medical. Well, in addition to that, there are also constraints on topic, in which questions from medical staff about bodily functions and sexual experience, let's say, of their patients must strictly related or relevant to the medical problem at issue. Furthermore, medical staff also making efforts to balance the disengagement with sensitivity in accordance with the pressures or contradictory pressure we discussed earlier. And this is evident in their discourse. Take for instance, they often avoid using terms which might embarrass their patients. So in turn, they rather use euphemism. Example, did you wash between your legs? Or they rely upon deictic expressions. Example, when did you first notice difficulty down below? And aside from that, doctors also use a soft, soothing voice to encourage the patient to relax. Example, when they say things like, now relax as much as you can, I'll be as gentle as I can. And this eventually contributes to personalizing the examination. But our focus here is power behind discourse. Well, the power effect in this discourse type with these properties comes to be imposed upon all of those involved participants, such as the medical staff as well as the patient or patients. Apparently, it is imposed by the medical institution or system itself. That is why it is referred to as power behind discourse. But the power behind the conventions of a discourse type belongs not to the institution itself, but to the power holders in the institution. Furthermore, one indication of this is the policing of conventions. It is the way they are enforced. Well, in the example, the conventions which position these medical staff and patients in relation to each other can be considered as embodying the dominant ideologies of medicine as a social institution. So now let us move on to the third and final aspect of power behind discourse, which is power and access to discourse, as to who gets the access to a particular discourse. So for this topic, let us consider the religious rituals such as church services as our example, for this will eventually serve to illustrate constraints on access. How? Well, as you can see, you can only officiate at a church service if you are a priest, which is itself is already a constraint on access. Furthermore, you can only get to be a priest through a rigorous process of selection. There will be criteria, qualification thing, such as being a believer, and you have to have a vocation, having some academic ability, conforming to certain standards of honesty, sincerity, sexual morality, and so on and so forth. Well, these are further constraints on access. It indicates limitations or restrictions. More so, another less institutionally specific example that shows an equally distributed cultural capital is the access to things that is concerned with literacy. And there's an evidence that access to literacy is unequally distributed. In fact, according to UNESCO, there is an estimated 1 million adults in Britain that lack basic literacy skills, and an overwhelming majority of these are working class people. Furthermore, having an access to these prestigious sorts of discourse and powerful subject positions will eventually enhance your publicly acknowledged status and authority. On the other hand, the exclusion of people or the peoples who are excluded from a particular types of discourse and subject positions will eventually lowers their publicly acknowledged status. Under power and access to discourse, we also have constraints on this access, particularly the formality or the formal situation. Formality is considered as a property of social situations, in which it has these peculiar effects upon the language forms. And as a property of social situations, it actually shows a prominent use of the three types of constraints, or the prominent exercise of these three types of constraints. So basically, formal situation deals with these three types of constraints. On content, formal situations encourages an exceptional topic or relevant and a more or less fixed interactional routine. And as for the subject, informal situation, the social identities of the people, let's say, who are qualified to occupy the subject positions are defined strictly and rigorously. As for the relation, it is usually associated with position, power, status, phase, and social distance. And that is why there is a high tendency for politeness to be presented. For that, let's take a look at this example. This is actually an extract from a transcript of part of the United States Senate investigation, and this is part of the testimony of one of President Nixon's most senior aides, John Ehrlichman. So what have you noticed from this example? Well, since this is actually a testimony, well, obviously the questionnaire is challenging Ehrlichman. But we can notice that the way the questionnaire challenged Ehrlichman, it is in a manner which is perhaps constrained by what we call the formality of the situation. And the taking of turns is constrained within the concept of question plus answer pattern, with Dash asking and in turn and Lurchman answering. So notice number 7. It is actually a challenge, but it is stated in an indirect manner because Dash has put it in a question form. So consequently, it comes across as restrained. Hence, one of the most striking indications of formality in this example is the choice of vocabulary, particularly the consistent selection of formal words. And aside from that, there is also the use of more polite modes of address, which is addressing Jan using his surname. Furthermore, formal situations is regarded as adding extra constraint, which is a constraint on language form, because in formal situation, there is a need for language consistency or consistency on the language form. Meanwhile, discourse and practice generally in formal situations are considered to be difficult and demanding because of too strict restraints or constraints on a particular discourse. Now let us move on to our last topic, which is social struggle in discourse, which suggests that power in discourse or behind discourse is not a permanent and undisputed attribute of any one person or social grouping, because this can still be challenged by what we call struggle or social struggle in discourse. And for that, we have here an example, which is an interview between a youth, which is the Y here, the youth suspect, and his headmaster, which is the H. So what have you noticed from this example? Well, if we compare it to our first example, which is a visit to a premature baby, well, we will not expect that the youth will ask questions and then in turn the headmaster answer them. Well, but this situation proved us wrong because the youth did such a thing. Firstly, he challenges the headmaster's questions on two occasions, just like in number 2 and 4. Well, aside from that, we can also notice that Y asks a question and in turn H answers them, just like in turn 6. Well, we wouldn't expect this thing to happen, right? But it happened anyway. Also, the answers which Y does give to H questions actually go beyond what is directly relevant in turn 6 and 8. Now, if we recall our example, the previous example, which is in the medical text, a requirement of relevance is strictly enforced in that particular discourse by the doctor. But in this case, it is not. And aside from that, there's also an indication that the participant here doesn't adhere to a formal setting. He appears to treat the interview to an extent as if it were a conversation, but nevertheless, H here maintained quite a lot of control. Because most of the questions are actually asked by him, and some at least are answered fairly and compliantly, which indicates a level of adherence to conventional rights and obligations. This case can actually be regarded as struggle between an individual youth showing how unimpressed he is with school authority, which in turn he plot the conventional constraints, and a headmaster have to adopt tactics to deal with that. So basically, social struggle in discourse may contribute to the shift in power relations, and it has been checked and partly reversed in places during 1970s and 1980s. However, this does not mean that the power holders have surrendered their power, but rather it is just they are forced to exercise and reproduce it in a less direct ways. Furthermore, we can therefore conclude that power is indeed exercised and enacted in discourse. And there are relations of power behind discourse, and power is won, held, and lost in social struggles. And I would like also to add our three main constraints which are discussed almost throughout this report, which is on contents. The structural effect of this is knowledge and beliefs. For relations, it is social relationships. It's about establishing social relationships. Then for subject, it is associated with social identities.